So we're back here with like a new section now. Now we're going to move away from epistemology, although epistemology and reality and all these aren't entirely, separate. So they're not mutually exclusive. So what we said about some of the things in epistemology, you're going to start hearing some of them again, because how a person knows relates to how they might see reality in the world. But we're going to start focusing a little bit on, how do we see those things that are outside of us? How do we know those things that are material, but our mind is immaterial? So we're back to Plato. This time, instead of the Meno, we're reading the Phaedo. And this is just another one of his dialogues. And not that it's real important that you know a lot prior, but some of the people in this, like Cetus and Simmias and such, they were Pythagoreans. So you probably heard that term before, especially the Pythagorean theorem, like b squared plus b squared plus c squared. These guys were, always concerned about how things might have changed. In other words, how things transform. And there's also another school in there, like the Heraclitus and such, where everything's in flux. So it's not central to like the understanding of Socrates, of Plato's description of Socrates in dialogue with, Cetus and Simmias and such, but it has something to do there. And two, keep in the back of your mind that this isn't like, I'm not trying to sell their argument. I'm just trying to help you understand a little bit. And it's hard sometimes to keep this in context of the other works that they've written. Now, the dialogues, these things aren't always meant to be separate, especially like what we're talking about here. Like this first thing that we're going to be talking about per se, which is the argument from opposites. If you say, well, I'm not very convinced by that, he may not be really trying to prove this to you. He might be like working his way to another point, almost laying the foundation for something he's going to say later. But anyway, that's the idea here. We can go through this, but what did you think of this overall? Do you have any questions or comments on this argument from opposites? Something that didn't seem clear? What do you think? Sometimes we know things from opposites, don't we? I mean, we'll use that. It's not like this, Sometimes we'll try to, especially like we're talking about a lie, you might compare a lie to a truth. But he's making a little bit different argument here. He's making the argument that, the opposites, some things, have a transformation or a change from one thing to another. Particularly, his overarching argument through this is what happens to the soul. So we understand that the body and the soul are a composite here, and we kind of know the body's going to die. But what does that mean about the soul? And what does that mean about eternity with the soul? Now remember, how did Plato understand knowledge? How did we know with Plato? Because we're going to talk about it again today.
He thinks knowledge, learning is a process of recollection.
It's a recollection. Okay, so you could see why the eternal, changing of the soul from, one body to another might have some importance for their way of knowing, because we're in this other realm. And he may not be entirely arguing for this, but he's trying to say, look, this is, he's even talked about, isn't this the myth? Remember, when we hear myth, though, go back to think of the Native American epistemology, don't just hear story. They're talking about a way that you can relay some truth. So in this particular instance, if we know things by the previous existence of these souls in a realm or another, form, another body, the soul is the form, then, whether or not the soul continues is a pretty important factor. Because did you ever you see movies or something, or when somebody dies, what do you see? The soul's this wispy cloud-like thing that kind of comes out of the body, just, where does it go? That kind of thing. Well, they had those concerns too. What's the sense of this? Which, you think about it, like from a Christian standpoint, and again, it's not exclusive to Christianity, the idea of an afterlife, gives hope, so it should reduce fear upon death. But this is pre-Christian, right? So they're sort of not fearing death either. Socrates didn't fear death. And Remy for the same way. He thought his soul's going to go on. This isn't the end of who I am, the end of me. There's something else behind all this. But he's going to start this by, let's talk about the opposites. And I guess we can kind of see how, larger things can become smaller things, right? I mean, a big boulder can be whittled down and become smaller. But how do you think, and this is a critique some people made, how do you think that holds up? Because something could be larger than something that's smaller, but what do you do with, something that's dead and alive? Is that the same? Do you think it's the same type of quality that we're comparing there?
I think a lot of the examples that he was using was about like physical objects and like physical states, and especially with like dead and undead, like sort of like the abstract of like soul, like it's hard to like grasp, and like I don't know if you can direct.
Yeah.
Yeah, like purely from an argument standpoint, like I don't think his analogy with like the boulders really makes sense, because yeah, you can make a larger boulder smaller, but like once it's smaller, you can't make it big again.
How do you make it big again? Okay. All right. And two, we could talk maybe in terms of the boulder being smaller and then smaller. I mean, there's not just two states, right? Large and small. But with dead and alive, people that are more dead? I mean, at some point we have to start asking questions. We see a little more of an absolute in that. So yes, we're alive. Now you might be able to say somebody has more health, but I wouldn't say they're more alive. I mean, we might talk like that, but we don't mean that they're more alive. We just mean that that person has more health and they're more likely to remain alive. So our language might be loose and a little weak, but dead is dead. I'm a literature person, so did anybody ever read, you know what Umberto Eco is? He wrote The Name of the Rose. He was an Italian author, very popular. I mean, The Name of the Rose is a movie that here in, you saw it could be the United States. But it starts out that way, he was as dead as can be. Like there's no understanding that you can't be deader than, once you're dead, you're dead. So, but maybe he's making the argument that, we're talking about death in terms of the body, right? So maybe if the soul isn't part of that equation, maybe his analogy might be a little weak, but his point might kind of be there. I mean, following his understanding of metaphysics, that the soul continues on. So it isn't the soul that dies. Remember, he's working out the idea of how can something remain, eternal? Like how can our soul progress from one body to another, or from another realm to this realm? It's not the soul per se that dies or experiences, but the soul inhabits another form, another body. So maybe the soul isn't the opposite of death. The body being alive is the opposite of death, and when death arrives, it's the body itself that experiences that, and not the soul. In other words, it might be wrong for us to think that he's really trying to make that argument in the end. People write papers on this stuff. You're trying to get into the mind of the guy and what was he thinking. But maybe he's just starting to make points, and he's starting to build this up, because this is part of a larger dialogue. Let's see. Well, we already talked about this. The reality is, okay, just to reiterate, is that maybe in some ways a change is an absolute, dead to alive. In other ways, we can start making comparisons. And remember, he's talking to groups that are interested, the Pythagoreans and the Heraclitus school, like how do things change? Okay, we still do this today. Science will do this all the time. This is what physics does, right? Physics will determine how things move and change in motion. So again, we have a little bit of arrogance that we're on the pinnacle of things, but these people are really working in rudimentary understandings of the universe. And you got to give them credit for how far they're getting. They've already come from the pre-Socratics, right? We're already beyond the fact that there's just elements of fire and water and air and stuff like that. But they're still trying to figure out how does all this work. And it sounds a little primitive to us. Well, these people actually thought that souls transgress from one point to another. Well, if you're a Christian, you already have some understanding of God illuminating the mind. You may not think that God just kind of plants this, the idea there, but you would at least hold that. So who knows? I mean, a lot of times from a secular atheist point of view, anybody who has any faith expression has already thought of it as primitive, right? So, we're looking back on, 2,300, 2,400 years here. It's amazing, like, how they're working through this, and it's amazing that we're still talking about these guys. And it's not just talking about from an historical point of view. We're trying to get to, like, what is this reality that we see out there? Well, you go back to the allegory of the cave, right? I mean, the reality, the realest of the real, it's out there. It's in the forms. We'll see as we move on today, especially in the recollection theory, we have some participation in these forms, but not pure participation. So we're not seeing things quite how we should. So the closer we can get to a mental understanding of these things, and the farther we can get away from the sensual and the material, then the closer we are. Remember, in the cave, that's almost like, Plato said, it's almost like the material aspects, right? You're still seeing things with the senses, and it's not like you're not seeing a table that's not there, but you're not seeing it in the real way that you should, right? And other things change too. I mean, this isn't entirely, off the base. Again, if we're going to talk about comparative stuff and not the absolutes, if you set a coffee out, it goes from hot to cold, right? If you just set it if you had a hot coffee, you set it on the counter, it's going to eventually get cold. So you might start to ask, well, what in that changed? What is that element? We call it temperature. But it took a lot of time for people to start to realize, what is the distinction between these things? Nonetheless. All right. Now, the theory of recollection. This should be something that's a reiteration of what we've already done. So you have this understanding that a soul pre-existed, and somehow these memories are locked in there. So remember, back in the Meno, how did Socrates get these memories out of the slave boy? Yeah, he started with the area of the square. Anybody else? Like, keep going with it? Yeah, and then, and we could debate whether or not he was guiding him, right? We can say, but maybe he was leading him and he read into the questions. Okay, fine. But his overarching point was, I didn't tell him. I just kept asking questions, and he seemed to have come up with the answer. Did he not? Yes. Well, where did this knowledge come from? It has to be there somewhere. Well, this is the recollection, and all has to be done is we have to find a way to draw this out. Now he's tweaking this argument a little bit. So, part of it was the boy and the liar. Anybody, Lear, how do you say that? I don't even know. Truth is, if you don't know, if I haven't said it before, but you don't know how to pronounce a word, say it like you're certain. And if somebody thinks that it's spelled, that it's pronounced differently, they're going to wonder if it's them. So just say it like the Lear, the liar. Anybody know about the boy and the liar? Let's do this. Did anybody, to make you sad, anybody lose a grandparent? Okay. So, what would be instances of memories of your grandparent? What would be like, you see it, and the first thing you do is you think of grandma. What are some of the things that would happen for you? You guys are lucky. I'm the bambino of a bambino, so I never met my grandparents. My last one died when I was 1 year old. My mother was the youngest of 12, and my father was in the middle of 14, and I'm the youngest of my mother, so I never got to meet any of these, right? So I had like aunts, Zias and Chuchis, depending on how you understand that I had. But I have memories. So what reminds you of your grandmother?
Ice cream and cookies.
Ice cream and cookies. You ate that when you went over there, I guess?
You just get it every time.
Oh, okay.
Every time we come over, ice cream. Cookie.
Specifically like Entenmann's rum cake. Like she would always have that for us.
Oh. Is she Italian? That's like
No.
that's like the Italian standby. There's Entenmann's and nobody touch it. That's when company comes over.
Mac and cheese because my grandma could cook, or cook lunch, she knew how to cook mac and cheese.
Is that right?
Yep.
The chair they always have.
The what?
When you see like a chair that they always have.
You see a chair.
Like wherever their house is located, so like by the beach, is like whenever I used to go to the beach.
Okay.
With me, fun to say, and tacos, because my grandpa would always like make tacos and freeze them and release them on Sundays, so he would give us a whole bunch of them. And when it was like sweet bread, he would always go and get some of that and give it to us. Like,
Isn't that something? Yeah. See, I was fortunate. I grew up near an Italian bakery, so we always had fresh bread. So, and they were my mother's grandma. So, you know, when we sit down and eat, my mom would say, "Go get the bread." And I'd run over and get the bread. So it's like anytime I smell, like my daughter lives near Pepperidge Farms where they make this stuff, and it's the smell. As soon as I smelled it, first thing I think was my mother. You know. Okay, so you know. He makes the point that, you know, the knowledge isn't in, you know, the cookies, the ice cream, or the bread, or any of that stuff, right? But there's something there. So, you know, it could be like somebody that you care deeply for even today. Like, oh, you raising your hand? No? Like a boyfriend, girlfriend or something. You know, there might be something that always reminds you of that person. Now, photographs obviously would be the thing, right? I mean, we'd say that's a little closer in assimilation, you know, to who they are. But it's not limited to that. It could be a rocking chair. You just name it. You know, it could be, I know this sounds really weird, but I also know that you're going to know what I mean. Like, old people's houses just smell different. I don't know what it is. I told my wife, I said, ours is starting to smell. What is it? You get to a certain age, your whole freaking house starts smelling like you're old. I mean, what could this possibly be? I have no idea. My wife thinks it must be like something in the carpet or whatever, but you know, we all have that. Like, I remember like going to my mother's house when you went upstairs, we had no air conditioning, and the upstairs was so hot. I mean, to sleep up there, you couldn't even sleep up there in the summer. And I lived in Pennsylvania. We'd have to go sleep in the basement on the cement floor because it was at least damp and cool. Upstairs, you would be soaked in sweat just from sleeping, right? But just that, like, the heat, like on the wood and like in the attic, it had that aroma, and you know, and it's like you remember these things. And when you smell those, it almost like it triggers, you know, which is probably why we're sold on Christmas, right? I mean, let's face it, you know, if you're at least grow up in the northern part of the United States, you wouldn't know how to associate Christmas with anything but, you know, snow and, you know, it gets dark early and Christmas. I mean, but all that stuff was part of advertising that kind of got sold to us. Obviously, they don't experience that down the South or in other parts of the world, right? So, you know, we connect certain things. So this idea that we can know something, you know, from a recollection, I think this is kind of where he's going with some of this. You know, don't we always have these experiences already? You know, so if there's a song that reminds you, or if somebody loved this young man and that man played, you know, the lyre, well, if somebody were to hear that, they might think of the young man. So he's trying to start to make the connection that, okay, what I'm saying might sound very odd to you. And he's using an analogy, but it's not an experience that we don't share. There's something there to it. At least I think that's what he's trying to get to it, right? So we remember, like, from that thing. So maybe this is not too different than him asking questions. You know, this might be another way to draw something out. We experience that thing, it's embedded in our experience, which this can go the other way too, right? People that have very traumatic experiences can be triggered or PTSD and such because there's something that's similar to that experience. Well, even when you explain to an individual, like next semester I'm teaching medical ethics, so we'll go through a lot of different clinical scenarios and such, and when you have somebody who has a particular experience, like let's say it's like rape or such, they become very, and I'm not diminishing that, it's a horrible thing, but they become very sensitive to any touch, to any intrusion into what they feel is their space. They rationally know that I'm not being, you know, violated right now, but you're a little close, you know, because they can't seem to disassociate what's presently happening with a past experience. You know, so like then we'll talk about, well, how does healthcare, like how do you work something like that out? But here's the same thing. You know, you're taking what was there in a memory, you know, it's sort of like lodged in there. We're not consciously walking around. You're not consciously thinking of your grandmother until, wow, there, now I'm thinking of it. Same thing with me, right? So these people that are experiencing PTSD, they're not constantly thinking of the past trauma, but there's something there that dislodges it, you know? So I don't think he was totally off. You know, we could argue about whether or not something pre-existed as a soul, but there's still something there, that rings true. And so I think, these guys, you got to give them credit. They were tapping into something, even if they weren't quite sure. And to be honest, somebody's going to think about this in 2,000 years. As certain as we are right today of how we know things, in 2,000 years they might find us to be very quaint, a little archaic. And they're going to say, but they weren't exactly stupid. I mean, they were on to something, weren't they? They kind of had it. They didn't have it right. We couldn't imagine what that is. Because we have a certain level of arrogance that we figured it out. And that somehow we've hit this plateau. They thought the same thing. I mean, if you read the pre-Socratics that came before them, these guys think we've solved this now. I mean, they probably didn't think they solved it, but they really think we've come up with this. I mean, he's very convinced. Socrates is not bullshitting, right? He's very convinced that this is it. He lacks particular knowledge that we have access to, but we're really standing on the shoulders of great people. That's the only reason why we can do it. Anyway, let me see what else is here. So when he talks about remembering, there's always similarities and there's always dissimilarity. A chair that a grandparent would have rocked in is very dissimilar from the grandparent. A photograph of the grandparent is much more similar, right? So there's always this, similarity and dissimilarity, and they have, but we might be going a little farther than he did with this conversation. This is where I think maybe we can think back to like even the Native American understanding of like how, being brought into our world and we have the experience is sometimes I think like the smell of bread for me is a stronger recollection of my mother than a photo. I mean, that's easy for me to see. It's almost like a one-on-one type thing, but the smell of it, because all the memories come back, and then if you're like me, you immediately put yourself in the kitchen, and you're sitting at the table, and I know what the table looks like, I know what the floor looked like, I know where the cabinets were, I can go and get that out of that cabinet.
I think the similarity can be understood as the strengths of an association.
Yeah. Rather than like an image or something, is what you're saying. Yeah, that's a good point. It's the strength of the association we make with it.
I think like certain images, like if I see a picture of my mom when she was little, like I'm not really gonna like feel anything, but if I see a picture from like when I saw them taking the picture, like that can really bring back a lot of memories, because then you're like, I remember like vividly when they were standing next to the Christmas tree, like in 2011, like taking that photo, like what was going on, and like all of that stuff, which is somewhat like a smell of it.
Yeah, it is something. I mean, again, we're not, like I said, epistemology, how we know things, we're so sure that somehow the what's reality out here. Did you ever have a dream about somebody that you lost, like, I'm talking in death or such, or maybe you just never see them again, and it was so real that as you started to wake up, you tried to force yourself to stay asleep, to continue to dream? You wonder, I mean, at that moment we're conscious we're in a dream. But maybe, I don't know, I have no idea the time limit. I mean, they say these things happen within minutes, right? When we're in this type of sleep. But that moments before, I mean, if I think I would have thought that is my reality, So, I mean, again, we're not trying to say that we're walking around in a constant dream. But, somebody like Descartes that really questioned a lot of that stuff, it's not as odd as it sounds on the first take. The more that you consider it, it's like, well, okay, I don't really agree, but I get it. That seems extremely real. And I don't know about you, there's been times where you wake up, and I'm not one that's prone to night tremors or terrors. I know people that are prone to that. I have no, there's nothing prevalent in my life that I can experience those things and have, that they happen often. But every so often you'll have some sort of night terror, and you wake up and you're physically shaking and sweating. And you are absolutely aware that that is not a reality, and it might take you 5 to 10 minutes to calm yourself down, So, I mean, this idea of how we struggle with what's real and not real, and what do we call real? And even when we say that those experiences were real, well, how do they affect us, and how do they affect our knowing? And then we can go back to even start asking about how great is our memory. Would that be something? What if we don't remember things exactly how they were? Because different people have different abilities to see things, and sometimes, even if we don't want to bullshit, we shade the truth in the past because we've repeated it so many times, it became our reality. So, you think of, like, what I liked about the article on bullshit was that it kind of like, it's where the rubber hits the road. It's like we can talk all we want about epistemology and how we know things and the various methods that we can profess, but when we're out on the street level, how do we do it, right? You see this a lot, like especially like when I teach, like even on medical ethics elsewhere, especially to nursing students and such. I see how we'll walk through all the various ethical theories. I'll explain Kant, I'll explain Rawls. We'll talk about justice between Hobbes and Marx. We go through everything. And then when I put a scenario before them, it's almost like some default position everybody goes back to. They might quote this person, but they would have said the same exact thing before I said one word. So you wonder, how does this stuff take, how does this simulate? Which is why I like starting this course with the Eureka idea. Because there might be something within this course that is, 5 years from now or 10 years from now is going to strike you as true. And you're going to finally say, I get that. Now that makes a lot of sense. Which is why I think a course like this is something that, the few courses that I took that were like this when I was an undergraduate, they're some of the few courses I remember because they had as an export into my life. And some of them were psychology and philosophy. It's almost like, wow, isn't it interesting? That really made sense. What changed? We could talk there about, what changed, going back to this argument from the opposites. What made me go from the state of not accepting it to the state of accepting it? There's really no new knowledge. I knew all that back then. What happened? Well, there was something in my experience that dislodged it. Did I always have it there? How was it there before? Anybody that goes into psychology will deal with this on a regular basis, trying to see how people move through these things. But, nonetheless, let's see, from the similar to dissimilar. Okay. What time we got? So then we get to Phaedo's equality argument. Now, he starts a little bit of a transition here between this theory of recollection. If we're going to talk about these forms that exist somewhere, the perfection of whatever it is, he'll start talking about, well, what is this equal thing? When we say two things are equal, to what degree are they equal and how are they equal? So, if we were to say two sticks are equal, well, maybe they're equal in length, but they're not equal in color, they're not equal in the type of bark they have. So something could be both equal and unequal. But does equal exist as something independent? Or does it only exist within those things? It's just a tool that we use to measure these types of qualities in the stick. So remember, with Plato, everything exists in its perfection in the realm of the forms. So the idea of equal, like remember when we use the word idea, we're talking about things that we can't put our finger on, right? Beauty, truth, goodness, justice, equality, those things are ideas. So the idea of equality. Now, before we go too far off on this, I'm not sure if we'll get to it in this course, but I'm doing another course in another place on justice, and we're going over equality now. When we talk about we want things to be equal. Like, in other words, does equal mean that everybody gets the same slice of the pie? Would that be one way of being equal? What if everybody doesn't need the same slice of the pie, right? Like, for instance, taxes, that we pay are typically, graduated depending on income. Well, maybe somebody would say that's not fair. And I'm making this up. Just it's round figures. If somebody makes $400,000 a year, why should they pay 50% tax? They pay $200,000. But a person that makes $50,000 a year, why don't they pay 50%? Would that be fair? That would be equal. Well, you can't quite make ends meet on $25,000, but $200,000 isn't going to put you in the poorhouse, right? So maybe equal isn't that everybody gets the same, but everybody gets what's due them. So maybe we're talking more equity than we are, exactly splitting it down. Maybe everybody doesn't need the same slice of the pie. So, these things have export into other disciplines. We're not talking about those now, but here we're trying to say, like, what does this equality mean? Did anybody pick up on? Anybody want to try to take a shot at what Socrates was driving at with this? I'll let you look a second, see if anybody comes up with some. There's an interesting question. When we start talking about equal, we're immediately in comparatives, aren't we? So you can't say that stick is equal. In a minute we're going to say that is equal to what? But when we have two sticks, I know this is going to sound silly, then we could say that, are they equal? So is equality something within the stick? Again, just try to think of it the way he's looking at it, as these forms that exist independently on their own in this realm. What is our participation? Now, where we're going with this, and where we're eventually going to start pulling some of this stuff out, is we're going to try to get a feel from at least the Phaedo how Plato and Socrates through Plato understands the reality of the world outside of us. We're going to look at a bunch of different thinkers, some that might totally doubt what's out there. Others, empirical science doesn't doubt it at all. What happens when something doesn't fit its realm of beliefs? It has to adjust. And then was it true before? You thought it was true. Well, it's only conditionally true. So we're never out of the woods with something like this, and we're never quite sure. Again, well, let's leave it there. So something can't quite be equal in itself. So the term that they would use is like when you see these forms on the outside of the cave, right? We know them to the degree that we participate in them, right? So if there's something that is, beautiful, whatever ultimate perfection of beauty is, we all participate that into some level of it. And usually the closer you get away from material things, right? Materials inside the cave, the more you get to the, things that aren't sensual, the closer you're getting to understand these things closer to the truth. So even, ideas like cold and hot, there's something out there, and all this is a participation in that. So he's starting to ask, well, in what way can then these sticks participate in something that's equal? In other words, it's probably not sensual. It's probably not best for me to use my senses to determine how these things are equal. There's got to be something that's a little bit beyond that, right? He's, at least the way I'm presenting it here, he's trying to wrap up where he began. He started talking about this argument from opposites. And like I said, that wasn't the end of his argument. So if you would have stopped at the end of him arguing the opposites, you'd probably think, where were you going with that? Because that doesn't really make sense. So any criticisms you had of it were probably, levied well against it. But remember, he's talking about the eternal aspects of the soul. And he's talking about the eternal aspects of the soul because that's the only way that knowledge is going to come, is that the soul, doesn't, can follow into a new body. It has to have this previous realm experience. This is the only way they thought they knew, so that you have to somehow then have this soul that's eternal. Because if it's not eternal, in other words, if you're going to go back and say, well, I don't like the argument from the opposites, and, well, if there's no eternal aspects to the soul, then as everybody dies, that's the end of it. And if we had a room full of 35 people and we're going to say there is nothing after death, then until the last person dies, then it's done. And remember, they think knowledge comes from the pre-existence of the souls. So what would this do to their epistemology? It'd wipe it out. It's almost like they need some way for this to continue on, but they also have to explain the senses. And the senses aren't really giving me, they're not as bad as maybe Descartes, doubting them, but nonetheless, they're still saying, we're not getting everything from these. That leads us into cave. It's not like it's not there, but it's not a higher level participation. The farther I get away from the senses and more towards the intellect and the immaterial, the closer then I can present, I'm participating in this. So what I'm trying to do is, I want this unchanging reality. In other words, they do believe in absolute truths. we just don't always have access to these things. So if this unchanging reality is out there, from Socrates' point of view, is how do we get to it? You know, we get to it through the recollection of this incarnate souls coming back into the body, and then through a series of dialectical questions, you know, something that triggers the memory. So it's this theory of recollection, right? And if that sounds a lot to you, let's go back to talk about how things remind us of our grandparents. It's like, well, that brings something up. That was back there. The only difference is we're saying it's all in one life. He's saying, well, okay, but can't that happen if the soul lives somewhere else? I mean, if we could take, your mind is not, at least my view is, your mind is not, your brain is not your mind. Well, let's say it was. Then we could take your brain out and put it in a different body. Would that body then have all the memories and experiences that you do? Right? So, I mean, all he's trying to say is it's coming from another life. Otherwise, we don't know how to explain it. And you go back to the slave boy analogy. He's like, where would this person have gotten this information if it wasn't already there? Because I never asked him. I just kind of said a few things, and he totally understood it. And now he does understand it, but he didn't understand it before, and I didn't give it to him. So it must have been in his mind somewhere. Where does this come from? Well, there has to be some place where all these things exist on their own. And in that realm is a totally unchanging reality that we participate in some way. But when we participate on the sensual level, we're kind of just getting, you know, the shadowy aspects of it. We have to get closer to the immaterial. And whatever it is then, that we can get closer to the immaterial reality, we're going to call that a higher level of participation. And that's the truth. So you could almost see Socrates, he wasn't fooling himself. This is what he honestly believed. So now when he goes back and they said to him, like we were talking about bullshit, would you lie to do this? Would you lie to do that? Socrates is like, no. Because that would be a very low participation with the truth as it is in this heavenly realm. And I already believe that the soul is immortal. The body will die, I understand that, but the soul isn't part of that. So there's always like this regeneration, this progression. So when he'd given the choice, which he literally had, you could run away. I mean, they told him. It was house arrest. This guy wasn't behind bars. Just go. You can leave Athens and nobody's ever going to come after you. And he said, no. That would not be a participation in the reality that I hold. I'm going to stay, but they're going to kill you. Why would I fear death? What I know as Socrates and the soul is going to continue on. I'm only benefiting from the memories that came from the previous life. Somebody's going to benefit from this. So why, as a philosopher, would I want to go anywhere? I go happily to my death, which he did, you know? So do you see how this whole thing works as a whole? Again, I'm not trying to say, do you agree? I want you to understand it, so that way you have an appreciation for how he worked out his understanding.
So when he means that like the soul stays alive, then it goes to someone else. So then that's
well, he doesn't really just flat out say. He kind of leaves that out there, right? Yeah, you could. I mean, he calls it a myth at one point. Again, not a myth like, hey, here's a story once upon a time. But he talks about did they go down to Hades, you know. But his point is there has to be some continuation of this. Maybe they just go back to the realm and live in the realm, you know. But they don't cease to exist.
So then when it goes to the theory of recollection, then your memories or like the knowledge that you already have is from someone else's soul.
Well, it's from the same soul that has been experienced all these things. Again, it's a bad analogy, but if we said that, like, you know, your mind is your brain is your mind, then we could literally, following that, take your brain out and put it into somebody else's. I know there's a lot of other stuff, but I'm trying to be simple. Or the brain in the vat. We're going to look at the brain in the vat, right? If we put the brain in the vat and hooked up certain electrodes to it, could it be like a mini computer? Now, before that sounds odd to you, there's a lot of people in artificial intelligence that think, is this how things is? You know, they don't. I mean, the one thing that science can't even seem to get close to is consciousness. You know, so where is this being in his mind? So yeah, it's this collection of memories. Just think about, you know, it's like sticky tape going down the hill. It's going to pick up everything along the way, and it never loses that. Somebody else has it; they benefit from all of that. So he doesn't work out. There's this, you know, okay, we heard it could go down to Hades. You know, get in another body. Could very well just go back to the realm of the perfections But there, it would literally see things, because it has no more central cage. It would see things exactly how they should be. And again, if that sounds a little odd, hello, Christianity. I mean, it's not that far off, right? I mean, the idea of the heavenly realm came from this. Like, that, okay, so that Christians will say, upon death, I will see things as they truly are. Well, we say, okay, you would say that from Revelation. Philosophy doesn't have any of that. But he's kind of come up with it on his own, just in a different, which is kind of amazing. I mean, let's not forget, there was nothing before. These guys, what they came up with is extraordinary, right?
Is there some changing reality, natural law observed from previous generations?
No, but that's interesting that you know about natural law. Okay, so that would be something that, at least, okay, from a Christian standpoint, it would be something that's eternal, that's been placed into a human person, and they participate in that. So, like a precept of natural law would be, okay, if you and your siblings, if you have any brothers or sisters, if you're playing around in a pool, and they held you underwater, what would you do?
Try to get up.
Okay, but nobody told you that, right? Nobody said, your mom wasn't sitting there going, oh, I should have told her you can't breathe underwater. You know that, right? So self-preservation is a precept of natural law. Nobody has to tell you that, right? You're asking me questions now because I'm guessing you want to get closer to the truth of whatever it is that you want to know. Nobody had to tell you that, right? You sought truth on your own. Self-preservation, truth, relationality, we can go down the list, right? Those are all known as like first level precepts. So, and I'm going to bring it back to what you're saying, because I think that was a good point you made. Even though they don't, the Stoics will talk about natural law, but in a different way. So the second level precept is, well, I have reasoning. I'm going to apply reasoning to a first level. So if I know that you have to preserve yourself, and if I know I have to preserve myself, then shouldn't I help you preserve yourself too? That means I shouldn't harm you. So to not murder somebody, you should know that. Nobody needs to tell you that. You know what I mean? So what happens though, like from a Christian standpoint, this heavenly realm is the mind of God. And then each individual, through natural law, participates in that mind of God. The parallel here is the heavenly realm is the realm of forms. And each person participates in that realm of forms, but their senses, their body, kind of makes it murky and muddy, just like within Christianity, our temptations and desires kind of make it murky and muddy. So there's a parallel there. It's pretty good that you saw that. Did that help at all? Or did I just go way off on a tangent now? I didn't even answer your question.
I'm still processing.
That's okay. But you got it in a sense. Okay, so what I like about your insight is here, any particular thing that we try to participate in here is only, it's only some level of participation. It's never complete. It can never be total because the body's holding that up. So wherever the soul goes afterwards, that's full participation. It's the same thing within like natural law. Whatever we deem to be something built, and natural law is not, people think natural law is like what you see in nature. Like animals do that. That's not natural law. That's just things that happen in nature. Natural law is what's within the nature of a thing. So in the human person, we could at least say, without argument, that a person is going to self-preserve, they're going to search for truth, they're going to try to choose good. Now, it may not be like good over evil, but nobody does what's bad for them. When somebody steals something, like I'm going to steal money so I can go and pay off somebody that wants to hurt me, that's a good. It's a good for me. You know what I mean? So we always, and nobody had to tell me that. So all these things are levels of participation. So it's not unlike that, you know, it's not unlike that. There's this realm out there. In Christianity, it's the mind of God. Now, the Stoics didn't see it that way. The Stoics, obviously, that's where natural law came from. It developed in Christianity, you know, from the Stoics. So, you process away. Yes?
We have like innate knowledge before we're born, like certain people have like different levels of like.
Well, that's one theory, right? I mean, some people do believe in innate. This isn't truly innate knowledge per se. Innate knowledge is somehow just placed in your mind. But there's plenty of people, we're gonna talk about probably people that have that. Some people do. We probably, at least from our standpoint, would talk about predispositions. You know, like might have some predispositions. But it's hard to explain sometimes, and I know we're getting off a little bit on